So, today I want to talk about the looming railroad workers' strike. Railroad workers are an essential part of the supply chain of the United States. Their work ensures that essential goods reach their destinations, especially because railroads are responsible for moving much of the country's grain supply and fertilizer supply, as well as important things like building materials, auto parts, and fuel. This totals approximately 33% of all US exports and 40% of long distance freight. So, when railroad workers are complaining about their working conditions and trying to negotiate a new contract, it's something that we ought to pay attention to, especially because the government already has, and the government has already taken a vested interest in all of this. In fact, about 2 months ago, the Biden administration actually prevented a strike by these very same railroad workers against the railroad industry by creating what's known as a Presidential Emergency Board. Now, this is a power granted through the Railway Labor Act, which allows government to enter negotiations to try to bargain, arbitrate, or otherwise mediate in order to avoid a strike in either the railroad or airline industries, since these two industries are seen as critical for keeping the supply chain intact. Now, the board is granted 60 days before the workers can legally strike again, and those 60 days end on September 16th, and negotiations currently do not look good. These workers have been in negotiations now for over 2 years and have worked consistently through the course of the pandemic without a contract, and have additionally not had a pay raise since 2019. That said, pay is only part of the issues in these negotiations, and a far more pressing concern to these railroad workers is their working conditions and safety. So we have here that railroad workers expect a new contract to deliver significant raises to combat soaring inflation, after they stayed on the job all throughout the pandemic. But many say they are essentially tired of being on call 24/7 and want working conditions to improve. The major freight railroads have eliminated nearly one-third of their employees, some 45,000 jobs, over the past 6 years, as they've overhauled their operations to run fewer, longer trains so that they need fewer locomotives and employees to handle all the freight. In addition to the disagreements over wages and benefits, the unions have stridently opposed railroad proposals to cut train crews from 2 people down to 1. Now, when spoken to about this, if this labor contract as it's currently presented is brought to their members, a labor spokesman had said, it will not pass. The workers are angry. They want movement on attendance policies and not to be afraid to take sick days or vacation days without the fear of termination. There will be no ratification unless this is addressed. Further, despite the grueling work schedules, workers explain that there is no room for error in the work that they do, given the important safety components of their job, such as transporting hazardous chemicals. Workers are legally permitted to work a maximum of 12-hour operations of the train, but the worker noted it often takes several additional hours for relief to arrive and to get to a hotel or terminal when away from home. While always on call, the work hours vary wildly and often change on a moment's notice, making it impossible for workers to adapt to healthy sleep schedules, having to piece together naps whenever possible while waiting to be called into work. And the companies, when hearing all this through the negotiations, have not actually agreed to allow all of these employees to take unpaid time off for doctor's appointments without being penalized. And this is a major problem. These workers need to be able to take time off. Now, to address one of the things that was brought up, there's one important factor that Republicans have been very, very adamant to urge President Joe Biden to rule against, which is this idea of a mandate that there is a requirement for 2-person crews to run these trains. Now, having a crew with 2 people makes sense. If one of the people gets sick while riding and driving the train, the other person can step in and take over. If something goes wrong in any way, shape, or form, there's someone else there to handle the situation. This is the same thing that happens with airlines when you have co-pilots. You generally want someone else there in case of any type of emergency. However, according to Republicans and railroads, President Joe Biden's Rail Chief Tuesday should rule against a rule that allows two members to be on these freight trains or requires it. We definitely want to address the risks associated with less than a two-person crew, Bose said at a House Transportation and Infrastructure hearing. However, Republicans and here industry representatives contend that a crew size mandate is unnecessary, while labor unions say reducing operators would jeopardize safety. So, when we look at all of this information together, we have here that the industry has been slashing jobs, and because there are not enough people hired to do the work, they've been expecting workers to be on call 24/7. Now, this makes things like having a life or sleeping an impossibility. Now, remember that these workers' job is to transport potentially hazardous material as well as necessary food supplies, and all of this is being done on failing infrastructure as a lot of train tracks and bridges are slowly falling apart due to them not being fixed or repaired or maintained. Now, to add to that, they need to do this sleep deprived. And if the Republicans get their way, they'll have to do it by themselves. This is a major set of safety issues, let alone an exploitation of these workers' time. The solution here is clear. You need to raise wages, hire more people, and maintain at least two-person crews in order to make sure that people don't fall asleep, get sick, or otherwise find themselves unable to perform their job carrying hazardous materials. This is not something that workers should even have to be arguing for. And if the railroad companies actually cared so much about the supply chain, these safety measures would already be in place instead of being dismantled by the very same companies that are consistently making record-breaking profits, especially as they raised prices during the pandemic. And if you want just one example, we have here Union Pacific. They have increased their revenue way more than what they started with in 2018 before the pandemic. Yeah, the pandemic saw them lose a 10% decline once, but after that, they've just seen a massive increase in their profits. And yet again, even with these record-breaking profits, they seemingly can't afford to take on safety regulations and keep enough people staffed in order to make sure that workers are allowed to take a day off. It should be evident at this point that both big business and government are worried about how this strike is going to affect things and how much leverage these railroad workers actually have here. But these railroad workers are not the ones culpable for creating these conditions. It's the businesses. These workers are essential to multiple industries, and it's estimated that about $2 billion could be lost daily when the railroad industry refuses to meet these workers' safety demands and concerns. And these are not unreasonable concerns and demands in the least. The fear of the companies and the fear of the government is evident in the way that media has been portraying this. And I'd actually like to take some time to take a look at a quick example of this. We have here an article from The Hill, and they state, even a short-lived interruption would create a devastating ripple effect on the nation's fragile supply chains, said Lee Sanders, Senior Vice President of Government Relations and Public Affairs at the American Bakers Association. Rail-dependent facilities would be unable to receive materials and ingredients, and millions of Americans a day would be unable to receive the baked goods they rely on to feed themselves, their families, and their communities, she said. A railroad shutdown in mid-September would quickly overwhelm grain storage facilities, leaving farmers with few options to store their crops and boosting the chance of spoilage. Many grain processors would shut down, raising the price of bread and other common items, while farmers would be saddled with huge crop quantities and lower commodity prices. If farmers don't receive fertilizer, it will result in lower crop yields, higher food prices, and more inflation for consumers, according to a CEO. Soaring food prices, which agricultural groups blame partially on existing railroad disruptions, have hit American families particularly hard. And then when we go into this grain exports and global food security, because roughly 1/3 of US grain exports travel by rail, a work stoppage would also cut down America's ability to ship food to a foreign nation, especially those in East Africa and the Middle East, that face a risk of famine following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A coalition of food and agricultural groups, including the American Farm Bureau Federation, urged lawmakers on Thursday to block a freight rail strike, warning that it would have devastating consequences for global food security. Now, first of all, this entire article, you can comb it from top to bottom. It does not once include the perspective of a single railroad worker. Now, how do you include an article talking about all of the things going on in the railroad industry and not address one single railroad worker? Second, I find it absolutely fascinating how suddenly these businesses are concerned with things like feeding the world when it comes to striking down a union. When a union goes on strike and they want to stop it, all of a sudden America can't feed itself. It needs food. The whole world depends on us for food. The supplies need to be maintained. However, when it comes to things like climate change and how it reduces crop yields, the effects of imperialism, or just generally anything that would shrink their profit margins to address, it just never seems to be an issue and never comes up in conversation. Now, this emotional plea has to be recognized as a defense of an industry that is refusing to pay its workers enough, is refusing to keep enough people on staff, and is refusing to allow workers to have free time as they're keeping workers on a near 24/7 call for multiple years in a row without a contract. It is only the benevolence of these workers that prevented them from striking sooner and at the height of the pandemic, as there is no reason that they should have to have been put through these conditions and not get the care that they need as essential workers. The framing should never have been to put the blame on workers in these articles, but to blame the businesses and the business industries for refusing to provide safe conditions for these workers who are just trying to keep the supply chains going and can't because they're worried about being sick on the job because they're tired. This is absurd that this is the type of propaganda that we're seeing coming out of a source like The Hill. But this is where we're at. Now, from the political side, the Biden administration has claimed for years it's pro-union. This is the greatest union presidency ever. We love unions. All the while, they've been slowing down these strikes. Right before a critical election, the Biden administration and the Democratic Congress is going to have to make a decision of whether or not to strike down this union. And this whole strategy that they're being put in place to have to try to figure out is not one that's going to be easy given their financial donors wanting to probably end this strike and the fact that a good number of workers in this country are going to end up being very devastated if they turn their back on union workers right now. Now, it is worth noting that Congress legally has the ability to intervene and has done so in the past. In fact, in 1992, the last time that we almost saw such a strike, then President George H.W. Bush pushed Congress to end the strike after only 2 days and forced the negotiated contract onto workers who had just turned it down. So the presidential board ended up taking their contract and saying, take it or leave. Do not be surprised if this current Congress ends up doing something similar. But given how many workers are still against the contract, and given that the important safety components are a huge factor for these workers, I would not be surprised if they continued the strike anyway, even without the legal authority or acceptance of the government, especially given that 99% of the workers had voted in favor of striking as of July. This is definitely something that we're going to need to keep an eye on over the next few days, especially because once September 16th hits, things can start to change very quickly. Whatever happens, though, I want to offer solidarity with these workers who are trying to keep safe working conditions and keep the supply chain moving in a way that's safe for everyone, including the communities that they travel through. If and when this strike happens, remind people that it's the companies, not the workers, who have caused this financial burden onto people by refusing to provide safe working conditions for their workers. So, with that said, if you've enjoyed what you've watched here today, consider liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment, as well as consider joining my Discord where we have political conversations like these. If you're in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, especially as political content like this can often be demonetized by YouTube. The links for everything that I mentioned are in the description down below. That said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you so much for watching.